I froze as the bedroom door creaked open. There he was, standing in the dim light, shirtless, eyes locked onto mine. "We need to talk," he whispered, his voice trembling. My heart pounded. This wasn't my husband. It was my stepson. And the way he looked at me sent a chill down my spine. Emily had always seen herself as the glue holding her blended family together. After marrying Mark, a widower with a teenage son, Dylan, she took on the role of stepmother with care and patience. She wanted to be more than just the woman who married his father. She wanted to be someone he could trust. For years, their relationship had been respectful, even warm. Dylan was quiet, introverted, and often kept to himself, but he never gave Emily any real trouble. He excelled in school, played basketball, and spent hours sketching landscapes in his notebook. Emily admired his talent and often encouraged him to pursue art more seriously. Mark, a corporate executive, spent most of his time traveling for work. That left Emily and Dylan alone in the house more often than not. She didn't mind at first. It gave her time to bond with him, cook meals he liked, and help him with school projects. She found herself becoming protective of him, sometimes even more than Mark was. But things started changing when Dylan turned 18. He grew taller, his voice deeper, and his once boyish features sharpened into something undeniably handsome. Emily noticed how girls began lingering outside their house, giggling and hoping to catch his attention. She laughed it off, teasing him lightly, but part of her couldn't help but feel a strange pang whenever she saw him with someone else. The night that everything shifted still played vividly in her mind. Mark had been away on a business trip, leaving her and Dylan alone for the weekend. They had planned a casual movie night, but halfway through the film, Dylan turned to her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. "You're the only person who really gets me," he had said softly, his words carrying an unexpected weight. Emily had laughed nervously, brushing it off as teenage sentimentality. But the way he looked at her lingered in her thoughts long after the moment passed. And now, standing face to face in her bedroom, his words echoed in her ears. She had told herself it was just hormones, just an awkward phase. But deep down she knew something about Dylan had shifted. And she wasn't sure how to stop it. The unease began with small moments, subtle shifts that Emily tried to ignore. Dylan started finding reasons to be near her, whether it was lingering in the kitchen while she cooked or brushing past her in the narrow hallway. At first, she chalked it up to normal teenage awkwardness. But then came the stares. Long, lingering gazes that made her skin prickle. She'd glance up from folding laundry to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met, he wouldn't look away. Instead, his lips would curl into a faint smile, as if he knew something she didn't. Emily tried to convince herself she was imagining it. After all, Dylan had always been affectionate, and maybe she was overanalyzing harmless gestures. But her unease grew. One evening, while Mark was still away, Dylan sat across from her at the dinner table. The air felt heavier than usual. He wasn't eating, just swirling his fork through the pasta, pushing it around his plate. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. He looked up sharply as though startled. "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" His eyes locked onto hers. "About how things have changed between us." Her breath hitched, but she forced a laugh. "What do you mean?" Dylan set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You don't see it, do you?" "See what?" "How different you are from him." Emily blinked. "Ooh, Dad," Dylan said, his voice dropping. "You actually listen. You care. It's different." Emily's heart raced. "Of course I care. I'm your stepmother." His lips twitched, as though the word stepmother had struck a nerve. "You're more than that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The intensity in his tone left her speechless. She quickly cleared the dishes and retreated to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she ran water over the plates. She could feel his eyes on her from the doorway, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the heat rising in her cheeks. Later that night, Emily found herself unable to sleep. She tossed and turned, replaying their conversation in her mind. Was she imagining it? Or had Dylan's words carried a meaning she wasn't ready to confront? The following day, she caught him in her bedroom. She had just stepped out of the shower when she saw him standing by her dresser, flipping through her jewelry box. "Dylan!" Her voice came out sharper than intended. He jumped and turned to face her. "Sorry, I was looking for that key you said you lost." Emily crossed her arms. "You could have asked me." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "I didn't mean to upset you," he said softly. "I just wanted to help." Her pulse quickened as he reached out and brushed a strand of damp hair from her cheek. The gesture was too intimate, too deliberate. She stepped back, forcing a nervous laugh. "Thanks, but I can handle it," she said, moving past him and opening the closet door to create distance. She didn't hear him leave. Instead, he lingered in the doorway, his gaze heavy. "I don't like seeing you alone," he murmured. Emily froze. She waited until she heard his footsteps retreat before allowing herself to breathe again. Something was happening, something dangerous. And no matter how much she tried to rationalize it, she couldn't escape the feeling that the boundaries between them were beginning to blur. The boundaries Emily had tried so hard to maintain began to crumble. It started with fleeting touches, innocent enough to dismiss, but lingering just long enough to leave her unsettled. One evening, as they sat in the dim glow of the living room, Dylan stretched out on the couch beside her. His leg brushed against hers, and instead of pulling away, he let it rest there. Emily felt her pulse quicken, but pretended not to notice. "I miss nights like this," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight she couldn't quite place. She forced a smile. "Me too." Dylan's eyes didn't leave her. "You're the only one who makes me feel like I matter." Emily swallowed hard. "Of course you matter. Don't ever think otherwise. But it's different with you." The words hung in the air, and Emily felt her cheeks flush. She stood abruptly, pretending to tidy up the coffee table. "We should get some sleep," she said, avoiding his gaze. But that night, as she lay in bed, her thoughts refused to settle. Dylan's words echoed in her mind, stirring something she didn't want to name. The next day, the tension escalated. Emily was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when Dylan appeared behind her. She felt him before she saw him, the warmth of his body too close, his breath stirring the hairs on the back of her neck. "Let me help," he said, reaching past her to grab a plate. His arm brushed against hers, and her body stiffened. "It's fine. I've got it," she replied quickly, but he didn't move. "Why do you keep pushing me away?" Dylan's voice was low, raw. Emily turned, her eyes locking with his. "I'm not pushing you away," she said, though her voice wavered. "You are," he insisted. "I see the way you look at me, like you're scared of something." Emily's breath hitched. "I'm not scared." "Then why can't you look at me?" He stepped closer, and this time she didn't retreat. Her heart pounded as his fingers brushed against her wrist, sending a jolt through her. "This isn't right, Dylan," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then why does it feel like it is?" Before she could respond, he closed the distance between them. His hand cupped her face, and for a split second, she felt herself lean into the touch. Reality snapped back, and she pushed him away, her breathing ragged. "No," she said firmly. "This can't happen." Dylan stepped back, his expression pained. "I can't stop how I feel," he said, his voice breaking. Emily turned away, gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself. "You need to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But Dylan didn't leave. Instead, he lingered, his presence suffocating. And as the days passed, the tension only grew worse. One evening, after Mark called to say he'd be extending his trip, Dylan suggested they take a drive to clear their heads. Emily hesitated but eventually agreed, hoping the fresh air would ease the tension. They ended up at a secluded park by the lake. The sky had turned a soft shade of purple, and the air was heavy with the scent of pine. They walked along the shoreline in silence until Dylan finally spoke. "You know this isn't just me, right?" Emily froze. "What do you mean?" "You feel it too," he said, stepping closer. "I can see it in your eyes." Emily shook her head, backing away. "No, you're imagining things." "Am I?" Dylan's voice was filled with desperation. "Then why can't you look at me without blushing? Why didn't you pull away when I touched you?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Because I care about you," she said, her voice trembling. "But not like that." Dylan reached for her, and for a moment she let him. His hands rested on her arms, grounding her even as her heart raced. "You're lying," he whispered. Emily closed her eyes, willing herself to step back, but she didn't. Instead, she stood frozen as Dylan leaned in, his lips hovering dangerously close. When he finally kissed her, it was gentle at first, hesitant, as though waiting for her to resist. But she didn't. The moment stretched too long, and when she finally pulled away, guilt crashed over her like a wave. "This has to stop," she said, her voice barely audible. But the damage was done. The line had been crossed, and Emily knew there was no going back. The kiss haunted Emily for days. She tried to convince herself it was a mistake, a fleeting moment fueled by confusion and emotions. But every time she looked at Dylan, the memory came rushing back, leaving her breathless and ashamed. Dylan, however, seemed emboldened. His glances lingered longer, his touches grew more deliberate, and his words carried undertones that made Emily's stomach twist. One evening, the tension finally exploded. Emily was in her bedroom, folding laundry, when Dylan appeared in the doorway. She looked up, startled by the intensity in his eyes. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Her heart raced. "Dylan, this has to stop." "No," he cut her off, his voice trembling. "I can't keep pretending. You think I don't notice how you look at me? How you don't push me away?" Emily froze, clutching a towel in her hands. "You're confused," she said, but even she didn't believe the words. "I'm not confused," he snapped, his voice echoing in the small room. "I know what I feel, and I know you feel it too." Before she could respond, he crossed the room and grabbed her hands. "Tell me I'm wrong," he whispered. "Tell me you don't feel anything." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "I can't," she whispered back. And then he kissed her again, harder this time, more desperate. For a moment, Emily gave in, letting the kiss consume her. But as his hands roamed her body, reality crashed down, and she shoved him away. "No," she cried, her voice cracking. "This isn't right. It's not supposed to be like this." Dylan stepped back, his expression a mix of anger and hurt. "Why are you fighting this? You know it's real." "It's wrong," Emily shouted. "I'm your stepmother, Dylan. We can't do this." The words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. Dylan's face twisted with anguish. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "You're the only person who's ever made me feel loved. Ever since Mom died, I've been alone, until you—" Emily's heart shattered at his confession, but it didn't change the truth. "I love you, Dylan, but not like this." His shoulders slumped, and for the first time he looked broken. But before either of them could say another word, the front door opened. Mark was home. Emily's blood ran cold as panic gripped her. She rushed past Dylan, wiping the tears from her face and forcing a smile as she greeted her husband. Mark wrapped her in a hug, oblivious to the tension lingering in the room. Dylan lingered in the background, his eyes locked on Emily, and she knew this wasn't over. That night, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Mark slept soundly beside her, but she couldn't shake the fear that everything was about to come crashing down. The next morning, her fears were realized. Emily was making coffee when Mark's voice called out from the living room. "Emily? What's this?" Her stomach dropped. She hurried in to find Mark holding Dylan's sketchbook, open to a page that made her blood turn to ice. It was a drawing of her. Not just any drawing, an intimate, almost worshipful portrayal of her in a moment of vulnerability, captured in breathtaking detail. Mark's eyes were filled with confusion. Why would Dylan draw this? Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked at Dylan, who stood frozen on the stairs, his face pale. "It's not what it looks like," she finally managed to say. Mark's expression darkened. "Then what is it?" Dylan stepped forward, his voice calm but strained. "I drew it because she's the most important person in my life," he said. Mark's face twisted in disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about?" Emily stepped between them. "Stop it, both of you. This is getting out of hand." But Mark wasn't backing down. "I want answers. Now." Dylan's jaw clenched. "You're never here," he spat. "You don't see how much she does for me, how much she cares. You don't deserve her." Mark's eyes widened in realization, and his gaze shifted to Emily. "What's he talking about?" "Nothing," Emily insisted, but her voice betrayed her panic. Mark turned back to Dylan. "You stay away from her. Do you hear me?" Dylan's fists clenched. "You can't tell me what to do." Before anyone could stop him, Dylan stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Emily collapsed onto the couch, her hands shaking. Mark stared at her, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "What the hell is going on, Emily?" Tears streamed down her face. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know how it got this far." Mark didn't respond. He grabbed his keys and followed after Dylan, leaving Emily alone with the crushing weight of everything that had just happened. Emily sat on the couch, her hands trembling as the front door slammed shut. The silence that followed was deafening, but her mind was anything but quiet. Mark had gone after Dylan, leaving her alone with the crushing weight of what had unfolded. Tears streamed down her face as she replayed the past few days. The lingering touches, the stolen glances, the kiss that had shattered everything she thought she knew about herself. How had it come to this? She knew she had to fix it, to undo the damage before it destroyed her family completely. But the look in Dylan's eyes haunted her. It wasn't just infatuation, it was obsession. And that terrified her. Hours passed before Mark returned. The door creaked open, and Emily jumped to her feet, searching his face for answers. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark's expression was tight, his jaw clenched. I couldn't find him. He won't answer his phone. Emily's heart sank. We have to go look for him. No, Mark said firmly. I'll handle this. I don't know what's going on between you two, but I'm not letting him come back here until I figure it out. His words felt like a slap. You don't understand. Don't I? He snapped, cutting her off. I saw the way he looked at you, Emily. And now I'm asking myself, what haven't I seen? Emily's throat tightened. It's not what you think. Then explain it, Mark demanded. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could she explain something she didn't even understand herself? Mark's shoulders slumped, and he ran a hand through his hair. I trusted you, he said quietly. And I trusted him. Emily's chest ached at the pain in his voice. I never meant for this to happen, she whispered. Mark didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed his keys again and walked out, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. Hours turned into days, and still Dylan didn't return. Emily tried calling him, but every attempt went straight to voicemail. She barely ate, barely slept, terrified of what might happen next. When Mark finally came home, his anger had cooled, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. I talked to him, Mark said. Emily's heart leapt. Is he okay? He's staying with a friend, Mark replied. But he needs time, and so do we. Emily's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Mark exhaled deeply. I think we need space, Emily. I can't look at you right now without wondering what else you're hiding. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the couch. You're leaving me? I don't know, he admitted. But I can't pretend everything's fine. Tears streamed down her face as he turned and walked out the door. The house felt empty without them. Emily wandered through the rooms, haunted by memories. She found one of Dylan's sketches tucked under the couch, a portrait of her smiling, captured with breathtaking detail. Tears blurred her vision as she crumpled it in her hands. She had to let go of the guilt, but no matter how hard she tried, it clung to her like a shadow. One night, unable to bear the silence, she drove to the lake house, the place where everything had changed. The air was cold, the sky dark, and the stillness only amplified her unease. She stood by the dock, staring out at the water, wishing she could turn back time. But the past couldn't be undone. A sound behind her made her spin around. Dylan. He stood there, his eyes filled with longing and pain. You shouldn't be here, she said, her voice trembling. I had to see you, he replied. I can't stop thinking about you. Emily stepped back. This has to end, Dylan. It can't, he said, stepping closer. You're the only person who understands me. Who loves me? No, she said, her voice breaking. Not like this. He reached out, but she pulled away. This isn't love, she said firmly. It's confusion. And it has to stop. Dylan's face crumpled, and for the first time, he looked as broken as she felt. I'm sorry, he whispered. Emily's tears fell freely. So am I. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone on the dock. The days that followed felt like a haze, an endless loop of regret, guilt, and fear. Emily couldn't erase the look in Dylan's eyes when she walked away, nor could she forget the pain in Mark's voice when he said he couldn't look at her the same way anymore. She stayed in the house, surrounded by memories she could no longer face. Every corner seemed to whisper reminders of what had been lost. The family she thought she'd built, the trust she had shattered, and the boundaries she had failed to protect. But she knew she couldn't keep hiding. Emily reached out to Mark, desperate to fix what was left of their marriage. He agreed to meet, but the conversation was colder than she had expected. I don't know if I can forgive you, Mark said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Even if nothing happened, the fact that it almost did, it's enough to break us. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. I never wanted this. I love you, Mark. And I love Dylan. I was trying to be there for him. I didn't see what was happening until it was too late. Mark looked at her, his expression softening just slightly. Maybe that's the problem, he said. You wanted to save him, but you didn't see how much he needed boundaries. How much we both did. Emily nodded, swallowing her guilt. I know. And I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. But some things couldn't be fixed. Dylan stayed away. He sent her one final message, a simple text saying, I'm sorry for everything. I just need time. Emily knew she couldn't force him to come back, and maybe that was for the best. He needed space to heal, and so did she. Months passed, and slowly, Emily began rebuilding her life. She started therapy, facing the emotions she had buried for so long. She learned to forgive herself, not for what had happened, but for the role she played in letting it get that far. Mark never moved back in. The divorce papers arrived quietly, and Emily signed them without protest. She knew it was the price she had to pay for her mistakes. But she didn't let the guilt consume her. Instead, she used it to grow. She learned to set boundaries, to recognize red flags, and to prioritize her own emotional health. In time, she even reached out to Dylan again, not to rekindle the past, but to offer him the closure they both needed. "I'm sorry," she wrote. "I hope you find peace." His reply was short but heartfelt. "I'm working on it. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough." Emily's story wasn't one of happy endings, but it was one of hard lessons. She learned that love, no matter how well-intentioned, could become dangerous without boundaries. She learned that trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to repair. And most of all, she learned that forgiveness started with herself. If you were in Emily's position, what would you have done? Could this situation have been avoided, or was it bound to happen? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more gripping and emotional stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Stay tuned. Our next story is even more shocking.